Superman began as a Depression-era power fantasy. Created in 1938 by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, he was introduced in the first issue of Action Comics as a bulletproof strongman who championed the underdog. Early Superman was far from the clean-cut icon that most people associate him with today. He was more of a crusader for justice, tossing corrupt landlords out of windows and threatening wife-beaters with jail time. But as the character grew in popularity, his image softened. He became a symbol for moral clarity, a comforting figure in uncertain times. By the 1940s, Superman was everywhere, in comics, radio dramas, cartoons, and merchandise. He was a character, but he was also a brand, and that brand quickly moved into film, though not always with the polish that you would expect. The first live-action Superman adaptation came in the form of 2 serials, starring Kirk Alyn, 1948's Superman and 1950's Atom Man vs. Superman. These were low-budget cliffhanger reels meant for Saturday matinees, full of crude animation and stiff dialogue. Alyn was even replaced by a cartoon double during the flying scenes. The following year, George Reeves took over the role in Superman and the Mole Men from 1951, which doubled as a pilot for the Adventures of Superman television series. While Reeves brought warmth to the character, the tone leaned more towards episodic morality tales than anything with real dramatic weight. These early projects were sincere but limited. They laid the groundwork, but they didn't really elevate the genre in any meaningful way. By the 1960s, superhero media had become something of a punchline. The Adam West Batman series premiered in 1966 and leaned fully into camp. Its visual flair, colorful villains, and onomatopoeia fight scenes gave it staying power, but they also defined superhero fiction as being something that is unserious. Don't get me wrong, I love Adam West Batman, but even at its best, Batman was treated more like pop art than a genuine form of drama. Hollywood kept the genre at arm's length, assuming audiences wouldn't show up unless it was ironic. For over a decade, the idea of a straight-faced superhero movie with high production value seemed impossible. In 1974, though, producers Alexander and Ila Salkind acquired the rights to Superman and began developing a film that they hoped would stand alongside prestige epics. They hired The Godfather's Mario Puzo to write the script, banking on his name to attract attention. His draft was deemed overly long and unfocused, so Tom Mankiewicz was brought in to restructure it into something leaner and more coherent. Around the same time, Richard Donner was hired to direct. Coming from a background in television and horror, he wanted to treat Superman with sincerity. Production was ambitious and often turbulent. The Salkinds chose to shoot Superman and Superman 2 simultaneously to save costs, but that decision led to scheduling problems and mounting tension behind the scenes. Donner regularly clashed with the producers over tone, pacing, and budget. He was eventually removed during post-production on the sequel, but his work on the first film held everything together. I won't necessarily get too far into that right now with the whole Donner leaving and then, the eventual Donner cut from 2006. Right now, this is just Superman 1. While major stars were considered, the role of Superman ultimately went to newcomer Christopher Reeve. He gained over 30 pounds of muscle for the role and delivered a performance that clearly separated Clark Kent from Superman through physicality and voice alone. Gene Hackman brought charisma to Lex Luthor, while Marlon Brando's brief but very expensive appearance as Jor-El gave the film an added layer of prestige. But John Williams' score cemented everything together. Rather than leaning into camp or borrowing from the jazzy energy of past comic adaptations, Williams composed something sweeping and operatic. The main theme functions like a musical mission statement, giving the film an emotional through line that elevated even its corniest moments. I mean, when you think of Superman, you think of that John Williams score. Combined with Jeffrey Unsworth's cinematography and Stuart Baird's editing, the finished product had the tone of a myth rather than a cartoon. And in the end, Superman wasn't treated like a superhero movie. It was treated like a blockbuster. And that choice changed everything.
To begin with, Superman caused a super traffic jam. The 950 or so who were leaving the theater parking lot were meeting head-on with the 950 or so just getting there.
Probably one of the greatest literary heroes, American heroes, and we got to see if they're going to do justice to the film tonight.
Growing up, this film was always in rotation. It lived on our family VCR, and I watched it often without fully connecting to it. At the time, we also had films like the Spider-Man trilogy, the X-Men films, and even the Batman movies on our VCR, and compared to those, it felt slower and quieter. Granted, those films are distanced by either a full decade or even several decades in the future, but still, it didn't have the large-scale action or visual effects that defined the superhero movies that I loved. I wasn't bored by it, but I never understood why it mattered. I guess I just didn't have the patience or perspective for something that moved this deliberately. Again, I was just a kid. That all changed in 2020 during the early months of the pandemic. I revisited it for the first time in years. I had just lost my grandpa, and without expecting anything, I found myself gutted by the scene where Pa Kent dies. It wasn't dramatic or drawn out, it just happens, and Clark's confusion in that moment felt painfully familiar. For the first time, the film's stillness made sense to me. It didn't need to be loud to be affecting. What struck me the most, though, was how carefully made it all felt. The performances are measured. The pacing gives every moment space to land. It feels sincere without leaning into sentimentality. There's no cynicism. There's no winking at the audience. The film believes in its own story. And now, I do too. After the destruction of Krypton, infant Kal-El is sent to Earth, where he's raised as Clark Kent by a Kansas farming couple. As he grows, Clark discovers his powers and his alien origin. Following the death of Pa Kent, he travels to the Arctic and learns his true identity. Embracing his role as Superman, he moves to Metropolis working as a reporter while secretly saving lives. There, he falls for journalist Lois Lane and becomes a public hero. Meanwhile, criminal mastermind Lex Luthor plots to destroy California with a hijacked nuclear missile. Superman stops the plan, but not before Lois dies. In grief, he flies around the Earth, reversing time and saving her life. What stands out immediately when revisiting Superman is how unassuming Christopher Reeve's introduction is. He's the third actor listed in the opening credits, behind Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman. That might seem bizarre now, considering he plays the title character, but at the time it reflected the reality of the production. Brando, at this point, was a global icon. Hackman had just won an Oscar. Reeve, by comparison, was a complete unknown. And yet, Reeve is the reason the film works so well. Everyone knows it now. The legacy of the character, the look, the tone, the entire modern image of Superman is tied to his performance. You can recast Batman a dozen times and audiences will debate who's the best. With Superman, it's different. Reeve owns it. There's a reason every actor who's played the role since is compared to him, and usually comes up short. What makes his performance so lasting isn't just the physical transformation, though that is impressive. He bulked up and changed his posture and trained for the role, but the real impact is the nuance. He gives Superman presence without ever making him feel smug.
Easy, miss. I've got you.
You've got me! Who's got you?
There's a softness to how he speaks, a kindness behind the confidence. At the same time, his version of Clark Kent is all restraint and deflection. The change in body language is so subtle you can see it even when he's just standing in a room. Reeve doesn't play them as opposites. He plays Clark as Superman's camouflage, rather than his opposite self, and that choice gives the character dignity. You believe he means what he says. You believe he wants to help. And that kind of performance only works when there's no trace of irony or distance. Reeve never winks at the camera. He doesn't try to make the character modern or self-aware. He just plays it with conviction, and that conviction is what makes the rest of the film just feel grounded, even when the story leans into the cheesier aspects of either science fiction or fantasy. In my opinion, the flying sequences in Superman hold up astonishingly well. For a film released in 1978, the effects carry a surprising amount of weight. Even when you can tell Reeve is just suspended on wires, the illusion never fully breaks. That's largely because the visuals are supported by John Williams' score, which elevates every single moment. One of the clearest examples of this is the scene where Superman and Lois touch fingertips mid-flight. It's simple, even restrained, but the way it's framed and scored makes it feel monumental. One performance that often goes unnoticed is Jeff East as the teenage Clark Kent. His role is brief but essential, and the casting couldn't have been more precise. East looks like a younger version of Christopher Reeve, and the transition feels seamless. It's true that Reeve was overdubbed onto his voice, which is an odd creative choice, but it barely registers while watching.
I mean, every time I get the football, I can make a touchdown.
That's for sure.
Every time.
East's physical acting more than compensates. During the sequence where Pa Kent dies and is later buried, East carries the emotional weight of the moment through posture and expression. His grief reads clearly, even without his own voice, and that's not easy to pull off. The film uses that moment to teach Clark a very hard truth. There are some things he can't stop. That lesson doesn't entirely hold, though, considering the later time reversal sequence, but in isolation, the scene works. It lands even harder in the follow-up scene where Clark tells his mother that he has to leave. It's set in a quiet cornfield at sunrise. It's one of my favorite moments in the entire film. The way the camera holds on Ma Kent as she watches her son looking towards something bigger than himself says everything. The writing focuses not on heroism, but on responsibility. You never hear Clark talk about how he's a god or how, this is his destiny and he needs to use his power. Instead, he cares more about his mom in that scene than anything. And honestly, I don't think that scene would have worked without the cinematography. Jeffrey Unsworth captures the Kent farm with a warmth that feels lived in. Every frame looks like it was pulled from a painting. The sunrise, the quiet framing, the soft focus, all of it helps communicate that this place matters. It's peaceful, grounded, and full of meaning. When the music swells and Clark hugs his mother, it doesn't feel staged. It feels like a goodbye. And the tenderness in that moment is something most modern superhero films don't even attempt without a joke. Here, it's done with clarity and care. The contrast between Smallville and Metropolis is just as striking. Where the Kent farm feels open and timeless, Metropolis is busy and kinetic. Sure, it kind of feels like a studio backlot at times, but it never feels overwhelming or hostile. The city has energy, but it's not presented as a threat, and that balance matters. Metropolis is not Gotham City. It's a place worth protecting. You feel that through the way it's shot. It's crowded, but it's never really oppressive. It's full, but never really chaotic. The film's visual language changes with the setting, but it remains consistent in quality. That level of craftsmanship is really rare, and it gives the entire film a visual identity that still holds up nearly 5 decades later. However, the film's biggest misstep comes in the third act, when Lois Lane dies, and Superman reverses time by flying around the Earth. It's a scene that's been discussed endlessly, but the issue, to me at least, isn't whether it's realistic. This is a film about an alien who flies and shoots lasers from his eyes and hides his identity with a pair of glasses. Suspension of disbelief, for me, is not the problem. What makes the moment frustrating is how it undercuts the earlier emotional core. Pa Kent's death served as a turning point. It told Clark that despite all his power, some things can't be stopped or reversed. That lesson lands hard in the moment, especially when paired with the quiet funeral scene afterwards. But by the end of the movie, the message completely changes. Superman turns back time to undo Lois's death, and in doing so, the earlier sense of limitation disappears. And it's not that I think Lois should have stayed dead. Her death would have flattened the tone entirely, but the way it's undone feels like the film stepping back from its own emotional stakes.
If he remains here with us, he will die as surely as we will.
The Krypton sequence looks incredible and establishes Jor-El with quiet authority, but it also includes the trial of Zod, Ursa, and Nan, which is a scene that never pays off in this film. If you know the sequel, the inclusion makes total sense. If you don't, it just feels like a strange, abrupt prologue to something that never comes back around. I'm sure at the time, in 1978, this scene was probably really confusing for general audiences. I know that this film was shot concurrently with the sequel, 1981's Superman 2, but I'm just iffy on this scene's inclusion in the film. Still, there is a lot that works. I love the decision to present Krypton without over-explaining it. The S shield is just there as a family crest on Marlon Brando's chest, while all the other Kryptonians wear different crests to represent their respective families. The Phantom Zone is shown but not explained, and the aesthetic choices from the reflective suits, the floating heads, the sterile atmosphere, they all signal immediately that this world is alien and finite. It's the kind of creative shorthand that treats the audience with respect. Nothing is ever spoon-fed and nothing drags. That same restraint carries into the film's depiction of Lex Luthor. This isn't the ruthless CEO of Birthright or the twisted genius of Superman the Animated Series. Gene Hackman's Luthor is something closer to a theatrical egotist with real intelligence hidden under showmanship. He's vain, manipulative, and oddly charming. Some might say he feels too light for the stakes of the film, but I think he fits really well. The movie has a broad tone, and Hackman plays into it without ever making Luthor into a joke. A complete joke.
Hi. Somebody hurt?
His plans are horrifying when you really think about them, and the calm with which he explains it makes him feel dangerous in his own way. I do wish that there had been more direct interactions between him and Superman. They only share 2 scenes, and while those scenes work, they don't build enough of a rivalry to anchor future films. A third encounter could have helped sharpen that dynamic. But still, this version of Superman is honest, kind, and deeply human. The Clark Kent scenes aren't filler, but instead they're the emotional foundation. Whether he's fumbling through a newsroom or standing silently in a Kansas cornfield, we understand who he is and what he values. Superman isn't flawless, but it is sincere. It carries a vision of the character that still holds weight, even in an era flooded with superhero media and dark, evil Superman that is an anti-hero, or it's an Elseworld Superman who likes to kill people, or even Omni-Man and Homelander and whatever the hell that is. This film doesn't try to modernize Superman or deconstruct him. It just shows us who he is and why he matters. The heart of the film isn't in the flying or the fighting. It's in the quiet moments. A hand on a shoulder, a hug in a field, a glance out the window at sunrise. These are the scenes that stay with me. They're simple, but they speak to something permanent about the character. As of the writing of this retrospective in June 2025, this is still the best Superman movie ever made. And maybe the reason that it holds up isn't because of how big it went, but because of how grounded it was willing to be. Superman 2 began life as a much larger project. In the mid-1970s, producers Alexander and Isla Salkind weren't just trying to make a single Superman movie, but instead they were trying to make 2 at once. Their idea was to shoot Superman the movie and its sequel simultaneously, a risky move that ballooned the budget and put incredible strain on the production. Director Richard Donner had already shot the majority of Superman 2 while finishing the first film, but the relationship between Donner and the producers deteriorated fast, and by the time Superman hit theaters in 1978, Donner was out. He wouldn't be asked back for the sequel. The key reason for Donner's firing was creative control. Donner clashed with the producers throughout the first film's production, mainly over tone. He saw Superman as a mythic, sincere figure, while the producers were more interested in spectacle and wanted a lighter, faster product. Kind of funny how history kind of repeats itself, you know? After Superman the movie became a box office hit, the producers used their leverage to push him out and hired Richard Lester to complete the sequel. Lester had served as a go-between during the first film's shoot, so he was familiar with the material, but his sensibility was rooted in satire and visual comedy. The tonal divide between the two directors shaped the final film in ways that were impossible to hide. Lester reshot large sections of the movie to receive sole directing credit, replacing or altering Donner's footage with a more ironic, stylized approach. Gene Hackman refused to return for reshoots out of loyalty to Donner, which forced Lester to work around his scenes using body doubles and stand-ins. Margot Kidder's performance also shifted between scenes depending on which director had originally staged them, and the inconsistency present in the film became a defining trait of the theatrical cut, and for years, fans debated what Superman 2 might have looked like had Richard Donner been allowed to finish what he started. Superman 2 also came at a moment when Hollywood was still figuring out what superhero films could be. The first Superman had set a new bar, but there was no roadmap yet. The contrast between Donner's sincerity and Lester's stylization created a version of Superman that never really felt stable from scene to scene. In 2006, after decades of fan campaigning and growing dissatisfaction with the original theatrical cut, Superman 2: The Richard Donner Cut was finally released. It restored Donner's footage and reshaped the story closer to his original intent. But that's a topic for later in the retrospective. For now, it's important to understand that Superman 2 was more than just a sequel, but instead it was a collision. It was a collision of egos, of tonal ideologies, of commercial needs versus artistic intent, and while that collision produced a film that many still consider to be one of the better superhero sequels of that era, the cost was still visible in every single frame. This, unfortunately, wasn't a singular vision. Instead, it was a patchwork held together by performances and just enough magic to keep flying. This is Superman 2. After defeating Lex Luthor, Superman faces a new threat when Kryptonian criminals Zod, Ursa, and Nan escape the Phantom Zone and arrive on Earth. As they begin their takeover, Clark Kent gives up his powers to live with Lois Lane, unaware of the invasion. When Zod seizes the White House, Clark must reclaim his strength and face his origins. Lex sides with the invaders to protect himself. In the final battle at the Fortress of Solitude, Superman tricks the villains into losing their powers while appearing to sacrifice his own. Powerless, they're defeated and cast into the abyss. With Earth safe, Superman reclaims his role, choosing justice over revenge. Superman 2 wastes no time shifting gears from the slower build of its predecessor. With the origin story out of the way, this film opens with the freedom to drop us straight into the middle of the action. The Eiffel Tower sequence is a very strong introduction. It's structured with clarity, paced deliberately, and grounded in a classic comic book rhythm. The setup is simple. A hostage situation with a ticking bomb, a determined Lois Lane, and Superman arriving just in time to save the day. The staging is clean and the energy feels true to the Golden Age spirit. There's an earnest confidence to the way it plays out, and it reestablishes the tone of this version of Superman quickly and efficiently. The moon sequence offers a much different tone, but lands just as well. Zod, Ursa, and Nan don't make a dramatic entrance. They drift silently through space, observing before they act. What follows is a quiet, brutal show of dominance. The moment where Ursa rips the patch off a man's spacesuit and lets the cold vacuum of space kill him doesn't rely on any crazy special effects or overplayed menace. It's cold, curious, and calculated. As the film builds towards its climax, the action becomes less focused. The Metropolis fight between Superman and the Kryptonian trio should feel massive, but it plays awkward and flat. The choreography lacks any structure whatsoever, and each beat resets rather than escalates. Characters fly into signs and crash into buildings, but there's never really any sense of actual danger. The fight doesn't build tension or reveal anything new. Instead of creating momentum, it leans on sight gags and empty destruction. What should be a very dramatic standoff feels like a parody of one. There's no weight to the blows, there's no desperation in the characters, and nothing about it brings the story closer to resolution. It just feels like it's padding out time. The end sequence in the Fortress of Solitude has even less clarity. By this point, the film is unsure of how to resolve the conflict. Instead of strategy or power dynamics, we get gimmicks. The mirror trap is very weirdly staged, and the moment where Superman throws a glowing plastic version of his crest at the villains is one of the strangest missteps in the entire series, which is saying a lot.
What was that? Yeah, take that, you jerk. That was a minor inconvenience.
Both the action and the tone in Superman 2 is incredibly uneven. When grounded in character and clear stakes, the set pieces land, but when the film reaches for spectacle and empty gags without purpose, it loses focus. This is foreshadowing, of course, for Superman 3, which is all gags, no purpose. But we'll get there when we get there. Meanwhile, Margot Kidder gets far more room to shine in Superman 2, and the film is better for it. I barely mentioned her in my retrospective on the first film, but here, she becomes essential to the emotional weight of the story. Kidder plays Lois Lane with the right mix of sharpness and warmth. She isn't just fast-talking and confident, she's observant, determined, and constantly pressing forward even when the people around her try to brush her off. But that energy never really feels performative, instead it feels lived in. She matches Reeve beat for beat, and their chemistry grounds the film. There's something awkward and sincere about the way that they interact. It's romantic without being cheesy. In a movie that juggles intergalactic threats and power fantasies, it's their dynamic that brings things back to Earth. The Snyder Cut, which is the theatrical version, the version that I am primarily reviewing in this video, unfortunately loses one of the strongest scenes between them. In the Donner Cut, Lois confronts Clark, she pulls a gun, shoots him at point-blank range, and waits for a reaction. Clark doesn't flinch, he doesn't get angry, he simply straightens his posture, lifts his head, and quietly transitions from Clark Kent into Superman. You don't get an explosion of power or a dramatic music cue, it's just a shift in presence, and that moment tells you everything you need to know about both characters. Lois acts on instinct, putting everything on the line to find the truth, and Superman responds with understanding, not outrage. He sees her not as reckless, but as brave. That moment, brief as it is, embodies why these characters matter. It's one of the most emotionally honest scenes in the entire franchise, and it's honestly what makes me prefer the Donner Cut over the Snyder Cut. We'll go into why later on, but For now, let's go back to the Lester cut. Where that version of the film stumbles hard is with the subplot about Superman giving up his powers. It feels like a narrative detour that's entirely unnecessary from the moment it begins. You already have 3 Kryptonian villains tearing through Earth with unstoppable force. That is enough of a threat. Taking Superman out of the picture for a stretch of the film really doesn't add any weight, it just kind of drains it. There's no real tension in the decision because you know he's just going to get his powers back by the end. Later films like Spider-Man 2 would explore the burden of responsibility in a way that felt personal and organic, but here the choice just feels forced. If anything, it's a plotline that's better suited for the third film. Once the world and the stakes have already been developed across 2 entries. I mean, imagine that. If Superman loses his powers for Lois Lane, and then it somehow malfunctions and creates that evil version of Superman, where then Clark Kent has to figure out how to stop him with just his own wits, and we get kind of that interesting character study that the third film tried to do but failed. I don't know. That's just fan fiction at that point. Another lingering issue with Superman 2 comes from how the film handles continuity from the first movie. The trial of Zod, Ursa, and Nan was originally shown at the start of Superman the movie, even though it had no real connection to the film's plot. That decision made the scene feel out of place. If you're only watching the first film, it reads like an unresolved tangent. Superman 2 opens with a condensed version of the same scene, which feels repetitive and awkward. It would have been cleaner to just remove the trial from the first movie entirely and allow it to play out in full here. That way, the story builds momentum from the start, and the villain's origin feels properly connected to the rest of the narrative. That's why I kind of prefer the Donner cut more, because having Jor-El guide Superman as opposed to his mother just works better with continuity. Despite those flaws, there's one element of Superman 2 that never falters. Terrence Stamp as General Zod. His performance gives the film focus whenever it threatens to unravel. Stamp never plays Zod as a cartoon villain. He walks into every scene as if it already belongs to him. The way he speaks, the way he moves, the way he stares down his opponents carries a gravity that elevates even the silliest material. He doesn't need to scream to be terrifying. He just needs to speak calmly and act with precision. In a film that often feels pulled between tones and priorities, his performance holds steady. It's not an exaggeration to say that he saves entire scenes by giving them a center. In fact, I would argue he saved the movie. He makes Superman 2 as good as it is.
Kneel before Zod.
Don't get me wrong, I don't hate this movie outright. I know I've been kind of negative, but I do think that Superman 2 is a film that is defined by its extremes. The highs work beautifully. The character work between Lois and Clark, the early villain sequences, and Stamp's presence all leave a very strong impression, but the lows are just so frustrating. Plot threads feel so undercooked. Key decisions are handled without purpose. The action, as I mentioned earlier, drifts between strong set pieces and baffling choices. It's not a bad film, but it's a film that carries the weight of behind-the-scenes compromise and doesn't always know how to hold it together. There's a great movie buried in the pieces. Sometimes it breaks through, other times it just slips out of reach. Now, throughout this retrospective, you've probably heard me mention something called the Donner Cut. What is that? Well, the 2006 release of Superman 2: The Richard Donner Cut was the result of a long effort to restore a film that had been taken out of its director's hands. The theatrical version was successful, but fans quickly noticed the tonal shift and uneven structure. As time passed, interest in Donner's unfinished version only grew. When the studio finally gave Donner the opportunity to revisit Superman 2, he didn't return to a finished movie. There was no complete negative, no locked edit, no score. Many of the scenes Donner had planned were never even filmed. Others were buried in storage or mislabeled. Donner had to reconstruct the entire film from a mix of original footage, recovered outtakes, and in a few key cases, screen tests. One example of this is the scene that I mentioned earlier, where Lois confronts Clark about his identity. In the absence of a final version, the film uses footage from Margot Kidder and Christopher Reeve's auditions. It's rough, clearly not intended for release, but it represents the only surviving version of that moment as Donner had conceived it. Another major change was the restoration of Marlon Brando's scenes. The theatrical cut had removed Jor-El entirely due to a rights dispute between the producers and Brando's estate. In the Donner cut, Jor-El plays a central role in Clark's journey, offering his remaining energy to restore Superman's powers. because in the theatrical release, he just sort of gets his powers back and it's never really explained how, and the whole dynamic of that just doesn't make any sense. And this sequence not only closes the loop on Jor-El's arc from the first film, but it also adds emotional weight to Clark's decision to return to his responsibilities. Reinstating Brando gave the sequel the same moral foundation that anchored Superman the movie, and it helped to clarify the emotional spine of the story, connecting that opening prologue to this film. The technical work behind the Donner cut was extensive. Visual effects had to be rebuilt from scratch. Music cues had to be reconstructed to match scenes that were never fully scored. Some transitions remain abrupt, and certain moments feel incomplete, but the goal was never to create a flawless final cut. It was about giving shape to a version of the film that had been lost to studio politics and compromise. In my opinion, the Donner cut is the best way to watch Superman 2. I say that as someone who genuinely loves the first film and appreciates how it carefully balanced sincerity, myth, and emotion. The Donner cut carries that same energy forward. It feels like a true continuation, not just in plot, but in spirit. Everything comes together to make the film feel more grounded and complete. It may be rough around the edges, but the heart of it lands in a way that the theatrical version just never really could. By 1983, the Superman series had lost a bit of momentum. The first film redefined the superhero genre, and the second was a hit, despite having behind-the-scenes conflicts. But with Richard Donner gone and Richard Lester fully in charge, Superman 3 took a hard turn toward comedy, one that alienated most of its audience. The producers aimed to keep the franchise as profitable as possible. They built the film around Richard Pryor after he had praised Superman 2 on national TV. He was cast as a computer hacker despite having no connection to the character or comics. David and Leslie Newman returned to write the script, leaning into slapstick and satire at the expense of tone and coherence. Christopher Reeve returned, but Gene Hackman didn't. Margot Kidder was cut down to a cameo after criticizing the producers, and Annette O'Toole stepped in as Lana Lang. Robert Vaughn played a generic tech villain meant to fill Luthor's shoes, and the effects were hit or miss. The lower budget really showed in more than a few places, but the film felt out of touch. By focusing on broad comedy and sidestepping its own mythology, Superman 3 reflected a larger industry shift toward brand over story, and the cracks were beginning to show. I, like a lot of people who saw this when they were kids, remember Superman 3 for one scene and one scene only. The moment where the computer becomes self-aware and forcefully transforms Vera into a cyborg. That scene horrified me. The way she screams, it stuck with me for years. I had vivid nightmares about it. It's a moment that still sticks with me to this day, even if I'm not sure how to feel about the rest of the film. This is Superman 3. Gus Gorman, a novice programmer, is hired by industrialist Ross Weber to manipulate global systems and build a supercomputer capable of controlling weather. Meanwhile, Superman returns to Smallville and turns erratic after exposure to synthetic kryptonite. This leads to a psychological split and a junkyard battle between Superman and his darker self. Regaining control, Superman confronts the supercomputer, which turns on its creators and forcibly transforms Webster's sister, Vera, into a cyborg. He ultimately disables the machine using acid and restores order. Gus rejects villainy and walks away while Superman returns to Metropolis, leaving Smallville behind. Superman 3 marks a sharp departure from the grounded tone of the original film. What once felt like a sincere attempt to bring Superman into a believable world now plays like a self-parody. The film opens with a slapstick set piece that feels more like a rejected Pink Panther sketch than a scene from a superhero movie. There's mimes, penguins, and blind pedestrians that populate the streets of Metropolis. It turns the once grounded and realistic city into a cartoon. There's never really any texture or a sense of place. It never feels lived in. It ends up feeling like the Lego adaptation of Superman 3 rather than a proper sequel to the first two films. The Metropolis of Superman 3 feels like a backlot. It feels staged, like everyone's in on a joke that only the director finds funny. Meanwhile, Margot Kidder's near complete absence from the vast majority of the film only makes things worse. She appears very briefly at the start before being written off on assignment in South America. Given how central Lois Lane was to Superman 2, the decision to sideline her feels very hollow. Kidder brought wit and sincerity to the role, and her chemistry with Christopher Reeve anchored the first two films, and without her, the emotional through line completely falls apart. It's made even more frustrating by the decision to pair Clark with Lana Lang instead. Lana is charming in her own right, but watching Clark bounce from Lois to Lana without any acknowledgement of the past films just feels wrong. It makes Clark look emotionally careless, as if none of what happened before matters. This creates a tonal dissonance that the movie never really resolves. The Clark-Lana dynamic actively rewrites who Clark is and how he behaves. Coming straight off Superman 2, where Clark was willing to give up his powers for Lois, this pivot to Smallville courtship makes him feel very insincere. The film doesn't treat it as a conflict or even a complication, it just pretends that the last movie didn't happen. The result is a version of Clark that feels less heroic, not because he's evil Superman, we'll get there, but because he seems completely untethered from the emotional stakes that used to define him. And yet, Superman 3 isn't without moments that work. The chemical plant rescue is a clear standout. It's one of the few sequences that feels like it belongs in a Superman film. Watching him freeze a lake and drop it over the fire is the kind of creative problem solving that reminds you why the character works so well. There's never any irony, it's just Superman doing what Superman does best, saving lives with precision and compassion. If the entire film had been built with that kind of energy, we might be having a very different conversation right now. Christopher Reeve remains the best part of Superman 3, even when the script gives him nothing to work with. He still finds a way to bring a bravado to the role. One of the more underrated moments in the film is a scene where he dances with Lana Lang at a Smallville reunion. It's an awkward, dorky, but wonderfully sincere dance that is on par with Crispin Glover's infamous routine in Friday the 13th, the final chapter. It's moments like that where Reeve shines, reminding you that even without the cape, he knows how to play Clark as someone real. To me, what stands out about Reeve's performance here is how much range he's asked to cover in this film. He's essentially playing three characters: Clark Kent, Superman, and a corrupted version of Superman. Each feel distinct, and that's entirely due to Reeve. He plays evil Superman with an uncomfortable edge, leaning into a version of the character that's smug, violent, and clearly spiraling. The 5 o'clock shadow, the muted suit, the simmering resentment, all of it works visually and tonally. I love the stupid scene where he blows out the Olympic torch. It's so dumb, I love it. The fight between evil Superman and Clark Kent is the film's biggest swing. It's very ambitious, weirdly operatic, and filled with memorable staging. I mean, having it in a junkyard is perfect. But as strong as the set pieces are, the moment feels very disconnected from any real internal conflict. To me, that is a very big problem. The film gestures at an arc, but it never really commits to one. There's a single line from Ricky about Superman being in a slump.
Superman, you're just in a slump! You'll be great again!
But the story never really builds on that. There's no groundwork laid for a crisis of identity or purpose. The evil Superman subplot just happens after he's exposed to synthetic kryptonite. The split between Superman and Clark could have been used to explore doubt, guilt, or even burnout. Instead, it just becomes a gimmick of, what if Superman fought himself? That's an idea with potential, but here, it's all surface level. The film wants the catharsis of redemption without putting in the work to earn it. What could have been the emotional core of the movie ends up feeling more like filler. The character of Ross Webster doesn't help things either. Robert Vaughn does what he can, but there's just nothing interesting on the page. He's such a boring character. Webster reads like a placeholder, a Lex Luthor stand-in written under the assumption that Hackman would return. When that didn't happen, the film just swapped the name and kept the rest. He's not threatening, he's not clever, and he's not funny enough to justify the screen time. Every time he's on screen, the film just grinds to a halt. He's a reminder that the movie has no idea what kind of threat Superman should be facing. Now, Vaughn does bring some charm to the role, but it's wasted on a character that just feels unfinished. Gus Gorman has taken a lot of heat over the years, and some of that criticism is warranted. He gets an enormous amount of screen time for a movie called Superman 3, often at the expense of the title character, Superman. But Richard Pryor, despite the awkward fit, brings a kind of chaotic energy that the rest of the film sorely lacks. His performance is very uneven and some scenes fall completely flat, most notably the painfully unfunny bit where he tells Webster about Superman while flapping a pink sweater like it's a cape. But there are moments where Pryor's instincts break through. The scene where Gus drunkenly bonds with a security guard while wearing a giant cowboy hat made me laugh out loud. It's the only time the movie did that. Yes, it's ridiculous, but it's also the kind of absurdity that actually works because it feels honest to Pryor and the character of Gus. You can tell that Pryor was allowed to riff, and sometimes it sinks the film, but occasionally it gives it life. The problem isn't that Gus exists, it's that the movie bends around him. Scenes are structured to showcase Pryor rather than just serving the story, which leads to a film that just feels adrift. By the time the third act arrives, it's hard to shake the feeling that you've been watching Richard Pryor the movie guest starring Superman. That imbalance becomes more glaring the further the film goes on, especially once the actual stakes of the story emerge. The climax of the film is one of the weakest in the entire series. The computer-turned-sentient weapon never feels like a fully realized threat, and most of the tension evaporates long before the fight is over. The one exception is the transformation of Vera into a cyborg, which still carries a lot of horror with it. The scene is disturbing mostly because of her performance.
Sis?
Even that moment doesn't hit as hard as it did when I was a kid. As an adult, the horror feels blunted. The rest of the sequence is dull and the pacing completely collapses. The payoff with the acid being what destroys the computer from earlier is a decent callback, but it's not enough to redeem how aimless it all feels. There's just something so frustrating about how close Superman 3 came to being something better. There have been rumors that have circulated for years that Richard Donner originally wanted the third film to center around Brainiac, which would have pushed the series deeper into actual science fiction and open up a whole new dynamic for Superman. I wish we got that version. I really do. And you can almost see traces of it here with the rogue computer and the themes of manipulation and control. I mean, that whole supercomputer thing feels like something that could have been the Brainiac climax. You know, like, doesn't that feel like a Brainiac thing? At least a late 70s, early 80s kind of concept of Brainiac. Instead, we got something that never really comes together into a film that makes total sense. What we're left with is a movie that feels like a first draft. There's talent on screen and even a few strong ideas, but none of it really connects and meshes together. Superman 3 isn't a disaster. It's worse than that. It's missed potential. Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was released in 1987, a time when the superhero genre was on life support, and the once proud Superman franchise had all but burned through the goodwill built up by the original 1978 classic. The cultural landscape had completely shifted since 1978, and Tim Burton's Batman wouldn't hit theaters for another 2 years. Audiences had grown more skeptical, special effects were advancing rapidly, and Hollywood studios were beginning to prioritize bigger action blockbusters and sequels with films like Lethal Weapon, Predator, and RoboCop. In fact, these all hit theaters the same year that The Quest for Peace came out. For the Superman brand, though, things were in decline. Superman 3 had already alienated fans with its slapstick tone and Richard Pryor-led detour. 1984's Supergirl had flopped. Badly. The momentum was gone, and then Cannon Films came calling. At this point, Cannon, a production company that was best known for churning out awful, schlocky, low-budget action flicks like The Delta Force and Death Wish 3, acquired the rights to Superman through a deal with the Salkinds and Warner Brothers. They promised a back-to-basics sequel that would restore the character's dignity and focus on something important. Star Christopher Reeve agreed to return, but only under specific conditions. He wanted creative input, a socially relevant story, and the ability to steer Superman in a more thoughtful direction. He even went as far as to co-write the screenplay alongside Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal, framing the story around nuclear disarmament. It was the kind of message that Reeve believed in personally, but no message could survive the production collapse that followed. You see, Cannon Films was in deep financial trouble. The studio had promised a $35 million budget, but slashed it to $17 million just before shooting. Sets were recycled, effects were rushed, and flying sequences relied on cheap rear projection and sloppy blue screen work. The film looked unfinished because it was unfinished. Even returning stars couldn't save it. Gene Hackman was back as Lex Luthor, but was saddled with John Cryer's Lenny, who a lot of fans hate. By the time The Quest for Peace hit theaters, audiences didn't buy in. Critics mocked it, the film bombed hard, and for nearly 20 years, this was the final word on Superman in cinema, a franchise that began as a landmark in special effects and sincere heroism, ended not with a bang, but with a bargain bin whimper. The Quest for Peace holds a reputation as being the worst Superman movie ever made. Everyone from the nostalgia critic to Chris Stuckman have torn this film apart frame by frame. These are videos that I watched a ton of as a kid, but while preparing for this retrospective, it suddenly hit me that I've never actually seen this movie outside of YouTube videos where angry critics tear it apart. As a result, I wanted to watch this with an open mind. Is it secretly a diamond in the rough, or a piece of dog shit that deserves the reputation it currently has? Without wasting any more time, this is Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. Superman retrieves a Kryptonian energy module and learns that it can only be used once. After tensions rise between the US and the Soviet Union, he vows to eliminate all nuclear weapons by throwing them into the sun. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor escapes prison, steals Superman's hair, and uses it to create Nuclear Man, a solar-powered villain born from the nuclear missiles that Superman destroyed. After a series of global battles, Superman is weakened but heals using the energy module. He defeats Nuclear Man by creating a solar eclipse and trapping him in a power plant. Lex is returned to prison, and Superman reminds the world that peace must be earned and not imposed. There's a surprising amount of sincerity in The Quest for Peace, and despite its many flaws, I would argue it's a way more interesting film than Superman 3. The central themes of corporate greed, media corruption, and the decay of rural American values may be handled clumsily and presented in a really shallow manner, but they're still there. They're just right beneath the surface. The subplot that kind of starts at the beginning of the film and then is never really revisited, with the developers trying to buy out the Kent farm, touches on something really important. It's not just about Clark preserving his childhood home, but instead it's about resisting a version of progress that treats memory and heritage as obstacles in the way. Similarly, the Daily Planet being bought out by tabloid mogul David Warfield is a reflection of the late 1980s media landscape, where sensationalism was quickly overtaking journalism. Like I said though, these ideas aren't explored with much depth, but they're far more engaging than anything in Superman 3, which often felt like it was just killing time rather than telling a good story. Tonally, The Quest for Peace feels like a big course correction. It's clearly trying to recapture some of Richard Donner's sincerity while softening Richard Lester's slapstick tendencies. There's still levity, but it feels less forced. Gone are the sight gags and the cartoon sound effects that plagued Superman 3. What remains are character-driven beats, even if the execution doesn't always land. There's a real attempt to give Superman an ethical dilemma again, to put the character in situations where there isn't really an easy answer. Whether or not the film succeeds, the ambition is evident, and I gotta give it credit for that. That alone gives it more narrative weight than its immediate predecessor. Gene Hackman's return as Lex Luthor helps to anchor the film, even if the character is stuck in a recycled version of his old routine. Hackman knows how to play the part with charm and menace, and his presence gives the film a little more gravity. Unfortunately, he's saddled with Lenny Luthor, played by John Cryer, in full quirky sidekick mode. Cryer's performance is grating, though I don't think it's necessarily really terrible. He mostly serves as comic relief, and while the jokes don't land, they're more tolerable than the campier bits from Superman 3 and elements of the Lester cut of Superman 2. It's at least worth noting that Cryer would later redeem himself with a genuinely impressive take on Lex in the CW's Supergirl, though that has no bearing on the character here, so do with that what you will. The weakest link by far is the character of Jeremy. The premise of a schoolboy writing to Superman to ask him to end the nuclear arms race has potential, but it's completely undermined by one of the worst child performances I've ever seen in a studio film.
I just said I wish Superman would have said yes.
Now, I'm usually inclined to cut child actors some slack, especially given, people like Jake Lloyd, Macaulay Culkin, they're just kids at the end of the day, and I think it's wrong to completely belittle and berate child actors. They're just trying their best. But in this case, the delivery is just so flat and it's so unnatural that it breaks the emotional rhythm of every scene this kid is in.
I tell you who I'd write a letter to that would do some good.
Who, Santa Claus?
No, Superman.
Is some of that on the director? Yeah. The casting director? Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's not a good performance. One of the biggest issues holding the quest for peace back is the editing. There's a jagged, incoherent rhythm to many scenes that make it really hard to follow what's even happening. Basic continuity is often sacrificed in favor of salvaging whatever scraps the production had available. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the scene where Lenny Luthor traps the prison guards in a car and then sends it flying off a cliff. The sequence is cut erratically between the vehicle, Lenny's reaction, back to the vehicle, and then Lex Luthor watching from above, and then back to the vehicle and then back to Lenny. Each cut lasts only a few frames, and the result feels like a broken animatic rather than a finished scene. There's not really any flow, there's not logic to it, it's just a desperate attempt to disguise how little coverage they had on the day of shooting. At other points, the editing swings in the opposite direction, letting scenes drag with little structure or momentum. Dialogue exchanges are held in wide shots, far longer than they should be, and the action beats unfold in flat, static compositions. There's hardly ever any rhythm. This inconsistency, likely a result of both time constraints and missing footage, creates a viewing experience that constantly feels off balance. And the visual effects only make things worse. The flying scenes, which had once been a source of awe in the original Superman, are now clunky and painfully dated. Blue screen lines are visible in nearly every shot, and the compositing is just so sloppy to the point of distraction. It's not that the effects are bad, but it's that the film leans on them so heavily. Like, why did they write in so many flying scenes if they knew it was going to look this bad? Superman flying should be a moment of triumph, but here it just feels like a chore, and because the movie keeps returning to these effects-heavy sequences, their flaws are constantly on display, undercutting the spectacle at every single turn.
Destroy Superman.
Now, Nuclear Man tends to get mocked as one of the worst Superman villains of all time, but I think that criticism feels exaggerated. He's not really a strong character by any means, but he isn't the worst that the franchise has seen either. The concept of a solar-powered clone created from Superman's DNA and nuclear energy has potential, even if the execution falls short. What hurts most, at least to me, as a dork who likes comic books, is the missed opportunity to draw from the comics. A character like Bizarro would have fit perfectly into the same narrative structure while adding fan recognition and thematic weight. Imagine how fun it would be to see Christopher Reeve playing Bizarro. Instead, the film introduces a new antagonist who exists more as a plot device than a character.
Destroy Superman.
I don't know, I just want Bizarro in a movie. Just please, for the love of God, give me Bizarro in a Superman movie. That is all I want. It would be so funny.
People no take Bizarro serious.
Careful what you wish for.
People love Bizarro after me beat you.
Getting a bit more serious now and kind of winding down the Reeve era, what makes the quest for peace just so bittersweet to watch is knowing that this would be Christopher Reeve's final full performance as Superman. The film may be extremely flawed, but Reeve never treats the material like it's beneath him. He plays every scene with sincerity, anchoring the film with a level of integrity that the script doesn't always earn. Even when surrounded by unfinished effects and awkward dialogue, he stays fully committed. You can tell he cared about the character, and more importantly, about what the character represented. Reeve's passion is most evident in the film's social messaging. The whole nuclear theme is handled with little nuance, but the heavy-handedness feels completely intentional. Superman is a character that is not built for moral ambiguity. He is meant to represent clarity in a world defined by fear. Reeve's delivery completely reflects that. When he stands before the United Nations and speaks about peace, it doesn't feel like an actor just reciting lines for a paycheck. It feels like someone trying to say something real through the only platform that he had. That kind of honesty, even in a film that is this messy, is rare. Unfortunately, the quest for peace ended up being Reeve's last chance to wear the cape in a leading role. The poor reception shut the door on any future sequels, but even beyond that, his life changed forever in 1995 when he suffered a spinal injury after being thrown from a horse. The accident left him paralyzed from the neck down and marked the end of his time as a physically active performer. Years later, though, Reeve made a guest appearance on Smallville playing Dr. Virgil Swan, a reclusive scientist who guides Clark Kent toward understanding his Kryptonian origins. The The role was short but meaningful. It brought Reeve back into the mythology he helped define and pass something on to the next generation. For many fans, it was a quiet moment of closure, even though the quest for peace never gave him the farewell he earned. That small appearance carried a kind of grace that the films just couldn't. Oh yeah, and then he was in The Flash, and it was really gross. And they used this weird CG model of him, and it was just major skin crawl. So we're not going to really go on about that too much. But yeah, Smallville, good for you for giving him an actual kind of send-off. The Christopher Reeve era of Superman stands apart not because every film was great. I would go as far as to argue that there's one great film, and then the sequel's kind of, yeah, it's good, but not great. And then the other two are kind of bad. Instead, that era stands out because his portrayal defined the character for generations. Across 4 uneven movies, Reeve brought a very consistent sense of warmth, conviction, and humanity to a role that could have easily been reduced to nothing more than spectacle. Whether he was saving the world or fumbling through a scene as Clark Kent, Reeve brought a level of control and presence that grounded the material. What separates his portrayal is how much care he brought to both sides of the character. He didn't see Superman and Clark as opposites. He made them feel like 2 parts of the same person. His Clark wasn't just a disguise, and his Superman was not invincible. That balance gave the performance a quiet depth that never felt forced or sentimental. Looking back in retrospect, that's kind of what we're doing here, the Reeve era feels like a complete statement, even if the last 2 entries in the series fell short. The first film captured something timeless, and everything that followed, whether flawed or ambitious, continued to reflect Reeve's personal belief in what Superman could represent. He gave the character dignity, patience, and grace. No reboot or reinterpretation has ever fully replicated what he managed to do with silence, posture, and stillness, and they likely never will be able to replicate it. The films may vary in quality, but his performance never does. After Superman 4: The Quest for Peace bombed in 1987, Superman vanished from theaters. Warner Brothers spent the next decade then chasing a comeback, but couldn't figure out how he could fit into the post-Batman, post-Matrix landscape of cinema. Producer John Peters hired Kevin Smith to write a wild version of The Death of Superman, featuring Brainiac, a robot sidekick, polar bears, and a giant spider. Tim Burton signed on to direct. Nicolas Cage was cast as Superman, but after years of rewrites and ballooning costs, Superman Lives died in 1998. Next came Superman Flyby, a J.J. Abrams reboot where Krypton survived. Lex was a secret alien, and Superman was resurrected by Jor-El. Directors came and went. Brett Ratner, then McG, then Brett Ratner again. Nothing stuck. Meanwhile, a Batman vs. Superman pitch from Wolfgang Peterson made it to casting before getting shelved so the studio could reboot Batman instead. By 2004, Warner Brothers was exhausted. Bryan Singer then came in and pitched a different angle, a continuation of the Donner films, skipping over 3 and 4. So, the studio bit. Superman Returns entered production with Brandon Routh, Kate Bosworth, and Kevin Spacey. John Ottman scored the film, using cues from John Williams, and archival footage of Marlon Brando was worked in to reinforce the connection between those Donner flicks. Released in 2006, Superman Returns earned strong reviews but mixed reactions from fans. Critics loved the sincerity, but audiences were split. Some liked the emotional weight, others found it to be very slow, nostalgic, and out of step with the direction that superhero films were going in at the time. It made money, but not enough. Talk of a sequel faded, and so Superman's Return quietly ended as a one-off. As a kid, I remember being bored by this movie. The only memory I really only have of the film is the fact that a ton of footage from Superman Returns was reused by fans in all these fan-made trailers where it was, the Justice League versus the Avengers, or Superman versus Batman, and it would be the Christian Bale Batman that he'd be fighting. Beyond that, I barely remember anything about this movie. Is it good? Is it terrible? Is it mid? Let's find out. This is Superman Returns. After a 5-year absence spent searching for the remnants of Krypton, Superman returns to Earth and finds a world that has moved on without him. Lois Lane has a son and a new fiancé, and Lex Luthor is hatching a plan to create a new continent using stolen Kryptonian crystals. As Superman struggles to reclaim his place as a hero, he uncovers the truth about Lois's child. It's his own. The film culminates in a desperate act of strength as Superman lifts Luthor's kryptonite-infused landmass into space, nearly dying in the process. Revived in a hospital and quietly visiting his son, Superman reaffirms his vow to protect the Earth even if he no longer belongs to it. The first few minutes of Superman Returns immediately position the film as a continuation of the Reeve era. The John Williams score, the slowly panning starfield, the classic title font, and even Marlon Brando's narration, making it feel like no time has passed since Superman 2. If you've just come off a marathon of the Christopher Reeve films, like I have, it plays at first like the long-lost fifth entry. Singer and his team understood what those movies sounded like, how they moved, and how they presented Superman as a figure of myth. But as soon as the nostalgia fades, the tone of the film shifts into something much heavier than what we've previously seen before. Superman Returns is darker than anything Donner or Lester ever made. The optimism that once ran through those earlier films is pretty much gone, replaced with emotional distance and quiet melancholy. Superman spends large stretches of the film completely alone. The film looks and feels like a requiem. Sometimes it really works, especially when Superman is hovering silently over Earth or observing a world that seems to have moved on without him. At times, the film feels like the perfect continuation of the Reeve films, most of which involves the scenes with Lex Luthor. Other parts of the film clash hard, with the tone trying to recapture Donner, while also being its own thing. The Daily Planet is one of the clearest examples of this. The set design is polished and sterile. The newsroom feels like it was built for a different film entirely, one that is set in 2006. It's clean, sharp, and lacks the personality that made the planet such a memorable location in the original films. Characters like Perry White and Jimmy Olsen are redesigned to the point that they feel disconnected from the world being continued. However, Kevin Spacey steals the show. His performance as Lex Luthor is one of the most confident and committed things in Superman Returns. He takes the Gene Hackman version of the character and strips out the clownishness while keeping the theatrical flair. He's still smug, sarcastic, and obsessed with land, but this time there's actual malice behind it. Spacey never once tries to reinvent Luthor. He refines him. He strips away the bumbling cartoon energy that occasionally took over in Superman 4 and replaces it with a colder, more grounded anger. What makes his version effective is that he still carries traces of whimsy. The moment where he catches Lois Lane snooping around his yacht works because he seems genuinely surprised to see her. He walks in with total control, but the way he reacts when he sees her feels so spontaneous. Like even he can't believe that she's standing right in front of him.
Lois Lane?
The film also gives Lex a monologue that stands out for how precisely it defines his worldview. When he describes Superman as a god who refuses to share his power, the line cuts deep into the core of the character. Lex has always seen Superman as a threat to human potential. In his eyes, Superman is an obstacle, not because of what he does, but because of what he represents. Spacey delivers the line with conviction, but without moral clarity. That contradiction is what makes it work so well. Lex completely misunderstands Superman, but he believes that he's right, because he always does. All of this makes it even more difficult to watch the film now. Given Spacey's history and the allegations against Bryan Singer and producer Gary Goddard, it's impossible to separate from the actual movie itself. Knowing that a minor accused Singer and Goddard of sexual assault during the Superman Returns premiere, even if the charges were later dropped, completely alters the experience of watching this film. It's not like they were just random members of the cast and crew. These were the director, the villain, and the producer. They shaped the film's tone, cast, and content. And they were doing all that while allegedly exploiting the exact kind of power that the movie claims to critique. As a result, I think this is just a very hard movie to revisit. The filmmaking is competent, the performance is strong, but the people behind it brought real harm into the world, and it lingers over every scene they touched. I don't want to spend the entire retrospective talking about that, but it's still very important to mention, especially now in 2025. Getting back to the movie itself, it pains me to say this, but Brandon Routh never worked for me as Superman. His performance lacks the emotional grounding that Christopher Reeve had made iconic years prior. For years, People have dismissed Superman as being flat, invulnerable, and a character with no personality. Frankly, I really don't think that idea came from the comics. I think it came from his portrayal here. Ralph's Superman feels blank. He's physically present but emotionally distant, and the film doesn't give him the range or vulnerability needed to make the character feel human. The warmth is missing. There's no joy in the way he carries himself, and no internal conflict that feels personal. Some of that falls on the script. Superman is framed as being like a ghost, and the film never lets him fully re-enter the world. Every scene feels like he's apologizing for existing. That idea could have worked, but here it just drains the character of any momentum. Reeve could jump between Kent's awkward charm and Superman's quiet strength in a heartbeat, but Ralph never finds that rhythm. His Clark barely registers, and his Superman mostly broods. To be clear, this isn't about Ralph as an actor. He's great in Scott Pilgrim and very solid as Ray Palmer, but this role just boxed him in. He's stuck trying to honor Reeve while also carving out his own take, and the result is muddled. That mirrors the movie itself. Superman Returns borrows the music, the imagery, and the nostalgia of the Reeve films while trying to reboot the character as a lonely outsider. It never picks a lane, and Ralph's performance ends up being caught in the middle. Even with all that, though, the airplane rescue scene is excellent. It's the one moment in the entire movie where it fully understands who Superman is and how he should be presented. The stakes are clear, the pacing is tight, the visuals are clean. When Superman lands the plane in the middle of the baseball stadium, it's more than just an action sequence. It is a genius way of reestablishing the character to general audiences. He boards the plane and asks, "Is everyone all right?" Then he smiles and reassures the passengers that flying is still the safest way to travel. That is Superman. Not a god, not a weapon, just someone who's trying to help. It's the first time he's appeared on the big screen in nearly 20 years, and the film knows that. Using this sequence as a reintroduction to Superman is the smartest decision that the movie makes. It understands the weight of the character's absence and delivers a moment that lives up to it. For one very brief moment, the tone, the performance, and the legacy, it all lines up. It's just a shame that the rest of the movie isn't like that. The cinematography in Superman Returns is all over the place. At times, it feels deliberate and carefully composed. At other times, it just feels like someone smeared a yellow piss filter all over the lens and called it a day. The film has this sickly, brown, washed-out tone during several key scenes that actively works against the visual identity it's trying to build. Instead of evoking nostalgia or grandeur, it makes everything look artificial and flat. The color grading undercuts the tone that the film is chasing. Superman is supposed to feel like a symbol, but here, he often feels like he's standing under fluorescent lighting in a department store. The poor visual effects only make the problem worse. There are sequences that genuinely look unfinished, even for a film released in 2006. The clearest example is young Clark Kent running through the cornfield. He's entirely CG and the animation is stiff and weightless. When he crashes through the roof of the Kent barn, it looks like a cutscene from an early PlayStation 3 game. That scene alone feels like it belonged in a previs reel, not the final cut of a $223 million film. Even the sequences that are technically impressive, like the bullet to the eye shot, still have this weird glossy plastic texture that hasn't aged well. The flying sequence with Lois is a good idea executed poorly. It's supposed to be the emotional centerpiece of the film, mirroring the famous flight scene from the 1978 movie, but the visual effects in this version just fall short, and the direction lacks the rhythm and elegance that Donner brought to his work. Instead of feeling timeless, it just feels awkward and overproduced. For a movie that's trying to stand next to Superman the movie, the visual comparison is brutal. The older film, made with wires and rear projection, feels infinitely more grounded and romantic than this expensive, overlit sequence. And when the green screen fails, it really fails. There are moments where the compositing is so obvious, I feel like I'm watching The Office. Backgrounds don't match the lighting or the scale of the actors, and it's just so weird to me because this is not a budget issue. It is a decision-making issue. If a film cost $223 million, or nearly $350 million when adjusted for inflation, it should not look like this. Films like Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest came out the same year and holds up infinitely better. There's no excuse for the kind of rough compositing and textureless CGI that shows up all throughout Superman Returns. Beyond the visuals, the pacing is also a major issue. I do want to specify this isn't like a, oh, there's not enough action in this movie type of complaint. Not at all. The movie doesn't need more fight scenes. The problem is that the story moves slowly and rarely with urgency. Once Lois and her son are captured by Luthor, the pacing grinds to a halt. The yacht sequence drags for what feels like 30 straight minutes, and the energy never recovers. Scenes happen with no momentum. Entire stretches of that yacht thing could have been entirely lifted wholesale and dropped into the deleted scenes folder, and the film's runtime, which is 2.5 hours, does not earn itself. It's bloated with scenes that stall rather than build. On top of that too, Kate Bosworth's Lois Lane is forgettable. She's dull, passive, and lacks the spark that made Margot Kidder's version iconic. There's no wit, there's no urgency, there's no sense that she would ever chase a story into danger. The script hints at depth, like her fiancé taking her flying as a grounded echo of Superman, but it never goes anywhere. The casting just doesn't work, and the writing gives her nothing to play with. The core problem with Superman Returns is its indecision. It wants to be a sequel, and it wants to be a reboot, but it never knows which route to actually take. There are strong moments like the airplane rescue, Luthor's monologues, and the John Williams score, but they're fragments and not foundations. In the end, the film sits awkwardly between two versions of Superman, never fully becoming one of its own. No version of the DC universe has been more argued about, defended, hated, recut, or abandoned than the Snyderverse. It split fans, fractured the studio, and kicked off one of the loudest and most cringe online movements in modern film history.
I'll never watch Birds of Prey. Oh, yeah.
None of it was planned. What began as a grounded Superman reboot spiraled into a rushed attempt at a cinematic universe. Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Justice League were meant to rival Marvel, but instead became a cautionary tale about what happens when a billion-dollar franchise is built around a director the studio never fully trusted. In this video, I'm breaking down those three films, how they got made, what it was aiming for, how audiences responded, and where I stand on it today. This is the rise and fall of a franchise that never found stable ground, not because it lacked an audience, but because it kept getting pulled in opposite directions. Every studio pivot and every hashtag was just another symptom of a universe collapsing before it even finished Act 1. By 2010, Warner Brothers was desperate. The Dark Knight had raised the bar, but Superman Returns left no impact. It was too safe, too nostalgic, and at the end of the day, nobody cared. The studio wanted something modern to rival Marvel's rise. With Nolan finishing his Batman trilogy, they brought him on to produce a new Superman film. He declined to direct, but his name became the main marketing hook. David S. Goyer was hired to write, Zack Snyder to direct, and Snyder pitched Superman as being a mythic and unknowable force. Goyer approached it like a first contact story, and together they reimagined Superman as something distant, less human, more alien. Man of Steel was released in 2013. The first 30 minutes or so take place entirely on Krypton, with Russell Crowe riding dragons and firing plasma rifles. From there, the movie follows Clark Kent as he wanders the Earth, working odd jobs, getting into bar fights, and flashing back to his time with the Kents. Eventually, General Zod arrives and threatens to terraform the planet. Clark becomes Superman and stops him, killing Zod in a climactic battle that levels most of Metropolis. The reaction was immediate and messy. Critics were split. Some liked the visual scope and scale of it. Others found it to be very cold and joyless. Fans argued over whether the character was being redefined or misrepresented. The only thing people agreed on was that the movie felt massive. It made good money, but the conversation around it never settled.
Man of Steel sucks! Man of Steel is freaking awesome and you know it! Yeah, maybe for blood-hungry psychopaths, but for those of us who love an American icon, it's bullshit!
When I first saw it, I thought it was incredible. I was 11 years old and fully locked into the superhero craze. I had it on DVD right next to The Avengers and Pacific Rim. I watched it constantly. The grounded tone made it feel so cinematic. The fights looked like something pulled straight from a video game. I was obsessed with General Zod. I had multiple action figures of him. Back then, I didn't question any of this. It was just another cool superhero movie, but with better effects and a more serious vibe. I remember thinking the future of DC at the time looked very solid. But that didn't last. As I got older and actually spent time with other Superman stories, my opinion changed. Man of Steel does not respect the character. It repackages him as a reluctant weapon. He's not a symbol of hope in this movie. Snyder is clearly more fascinated by the idea of Superman, but not by who he actually is. The film constantly tries to make him feel divine, like he's a Christ-like figure, but that's never been the point of Superman. He's grounded, he's raised by farmers. He doesn't ignore destruction because he's above it. He steps in and tries to stop it. You don't really see that here in Snyder's film. The third act, by the way, is exhausting. The fight goes on forever. Buildings collapse nonstop. Thousands, probably millions of people die. And Superman doesn't really seem to notice or care. He dodges attacks and lets trucks explode behind him. There's no awareness, there's no urgency. The movie wants the action to feel serious, but it never shows Superman acting like a protector. Though one thing I will say is that the decision to have him kill Zod never bothered me. There is precedent for that in the comics of him killing villains. The issue is that the emotional weight just isn't earned. Snyder thinks that destruction equals stakes, but it turns into noise. Michael Shannon gives the best performance in the movie. He's fully locked in. Henry Cavill is just flat by comparison. He is a charisma void. He looks the part, but he never brings any warmth to the character. And it's not just him either. Everyone feels dialed down except for Michael Shannon. It's like he's the only one that's actually trying in this movie. Man of Steel is a movie that feels uneven more than anything else. It looks expensive and occasionally ambitious, but it fails to grasp what makes Superman compelling. It builds him up as a god and forgets that he's supposed to be a human first. For me, it's a mediocre action film that fumbles the basics of the character that it's trying to reboot. That was the first red flag, and the studio didn't even blink. Instead of slowing down, they doubled the stakes. Before Man of Steel could even find its footing, they announced the sequel. Batman was coming. After Man of Steel, Warner Brothers had two options: build slowly or chase Marvel. They chose the latter. Instead of making a proper sequel, they announced Batman v Superman at Comic-Con 2013. The film became a headline machine. Ben Affleck was cast as Batman, Gal Gadot was introduced as Wonder Woman, and what started as a simple Superman sequel quickly turned into a Justice League prequel. World building, franchise setup, and spectacle all rolled into one. Warner Brothers doubled the budget, gave Snyder more control, and let him go as big as he wanted. The result was Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, released in 2016. The plot follows Bruce Wayne as he prepares to take down Superman after the destruction in Metropolis. Lex Luthor manipulates both of them behind the scenes, and Wonder Woman shows up with no context whatsoever. It all leads to a short and very disappointing fight between Batman and Superman, followed by a rushed battle against the CGI Doomsday. Superman dies at the end, and the movie ends on a cliffhanger teasing the formation of the Justice League.
What the fuck?
I don't know what the fuck.
What the fuck, DC? You're so fucking stupid.
It's safe to say that the theatrical cut was downright incoherent. Whole subplots were cut to meet the studio's runtime demands. The Ultimate Edition, which added 30 minutes back in, improved the pacing very slightly, but it did not fix the core problems that were present in the screenplay. Critics were brutal. Audiences were split. The film made money, but not enough to justify the backlash. Memes exploded overnight. Martha became a punchline. Lex Luthor's performance confused everyone. Behind the scenes, the studio went into full panic mode. I remember exactly how I felt after watching this movie. I was so hyped going in. I wanted this movie to be good. I thought it was going to be the greatest comic book movie of all time. But it ended up being the first time I walked out of a movie theater disappointed. It straight up broke me. The tone, the pacing, the characters, everything felt off. Even now, I find it to be a very frustrating movie to watch. It has moments that almost work. There are shots lifted directly from comic panels. The idea of Batman and Superman meeting on screen for the first time should be so exciting, but Snyder botches almost all of it. Batman in particular is completely wrong here. He looks great and the warehouse fight is well choreographed, but this is not Batman. This is the Punisher wearing a Batman costume. He uses guns, he kills criminals, and he mows people down with the Batmobile. I know that other movies have shown Batman killing, but that's never been the standard. It has always been a flaw in those portrayals, and it's even worse here because it's downright intentional. Snyder thinks that killing makes Batman cooler, but it just doesn't. It makes him hollow. What makes Batman so interesting is that he doesn't kill people, he doesn't use guns. And Superman is no better. Cavill plays Clark Kent and Superman exactly the same way. He's blank, cold, and passive. There's no real difference between the man and the Superman. He never commands a scene, he just kind of reacts. Once again, Snyder misses the character. He doesn't understand why Superman matters to people. This version doesn't inspire anything. He just drags himself through the plot like a burden. The fight between Batman and Superman is built up for over an hour and it ends in a single conversation. The conflict has no emotional weight whatsoever. Lex Luthor is the one pulling the strings, but Jesse Eisenberg's performance is borderline unwatchable.
Ahoy, ahoy! I did not know you were here.
He stammers and flails like a cartoon character. It's closer to the Riddler than Lex Luthor.
What does a rock have to do with Homeland Security?
Homeland Security? No, ma'am. Planetary security.
There's just no menace to him.
We don't have to depend upon the kindness of monsters.
And I'm gonna just bring this up, like flat out. Killing Superman in his second on-screen appearance is a terrible decision. In the comics, his death mattered because it happened after years of stories. Here, it happens before the character is even defined. The world in the movie doesn't even like him. There's active protests saying that he should go back to his home planet. So, when he dies, there's no emotional impact. The funeral scenes ring hollow because the audience knows that he's just going to come back to life anyways, and the characters in the film have no real reason to mourn him. It feels like the studio is just trying to skip to the climax of a story that they never bothered to earn. And the Doomsday fight is the worst part of the movie. The creature design is awful, the CGI is weightless, the setting is generic, it's loud and chaotic, and there's just nothing at stake. It's just exhausting and empty. What frustrates me the most is that this movie never feels like it cares about Batman or Superman. It cares more about the mythology around them. It cares about setup, the brand, and looking cool and being dark. It never once takes the time to understand why these characters have lasted for 80 years. Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is a total mess. It's self-important, poorly structured, and obsessed with tone over substance. Fans of this film have tried to spin it as being misunderstood or secretly brilliant, but there's nothing buried under the surface. What you see is what you get. A clumsy, loud, and deeply misguided blockbuster that tried to build a universe without building a story first. Warner Brothers wanted this movie to launch a cinematic empire. Instead, it launched a billion-dollar crisis. After Batman v Superman imploded with critics and confused the general audience, Warner Brothers started panicking. They didn't cancel Snyder's next film, but they made it clear that changes were expected. The studio mandated a lighter tone, a shorter runtime, and fewer self-serious monologues. Snyder was still in charge, but his control was slipping. Production began under tense conditions. Snyder had a full 5-film arc in mind, but Warner Brothers just wasn't interested in giving him room to finish it. Halfway through post-production, Snyder's daughter passed away. He stepped away entirely from the film, and Joss Whedon was brought in to finish it. What followed was a total disaster. The 2017 Justice League movie is a Frankenstein movie. Half of it is Snyder's footage, half of it is Whedon's rewrites and reshoots. The tone shifts from scene to scene. The visuals are so inconsistent and the pacing is completely broken. The worst though is the CGI, which is downright embarrassing, especially on Superman. His face is digitally reconstructed to remove a mustache that Cavill had grown for another role. It looks unnatural in every scene he's in. The film also added forced Reddit tier jokes and constant one-liners that feel completely out of place, especially from Batman. The plot is straightforward though. Steppenwolf, a generic alien villain, arrives on Earth to collect glowing cubes. Batman and Wonder Woman recruit a team, Superman comes back from the dead and joins the final fight, the world is saved, and nothing about the story feels earned. Character arcs are either rushed or missing entirely. Emotional beats are undercut by awkward humor, and the film ends without any real resolution because it was never designed to be the ending. It was supposed to set up sequels that never happened. Now, full transparency, I didn't see this movie in theaters. I didn't care. Suicide Squad was terrible, and I was burned out. I had no interest in watching another broken movie pretending to be part of a shared universe. I saw the trailers, I knew what it was, a studio film on life support. It's a product. I waited until it hit digital, and even then, I only watched it out of morbid curiosity. Rewatching it now, I still think it's awful. There are a few brief moments where it shows potential, like Cavill's Superman finally feeling like Superman. He actually smiles. Even though the CGI on his face is terrible and the performance is clearly phoned in, it feels closer to the character than anything Snyder had directed before. Whedon's writing is downright unbearable. Every other line is a forced joke. Characters don't talk like people, but instead like millennials tweeting. It's especially painful coming from Batman, who gets completely stripped of his presence and authority. He quips constantly and has none of the edge or weight that he carried in the last film. Flash is reduced to obnoxious comic relief. Aquaman is a dude bro. Wonder Woman is just there in the background, and Cyborg is barely a character. The whole thing just feels like a corporate obligation. It was made by compromise, and you can see the seams in almost every single shot. It feels like a tug of war of two directors with very different styles fighting over control. Surprise, surprise, Justice League bombed. Critics hated it, audiences were very underwhelmed, and it made less money than Batman v Superman, which already underperformed. WB had tried to salvage the brand, but ended up making things worse. And in the middle of all this, something strange happened. Fans started demanding the original version, the one that Snyder never got to finish. After the theatrical cut of Justice League collapsed in 2017, people were angry, confused, and convinced that a better version existed somewhere. At first, the idea of a Snyder Cut felt like wishful thinking. There was no finished film, just raw footage and unfinished VFX. But over time, Snyder started releasing images and storyboards. Cast and crew started backing it publicly, and what began as a rumor turned into a very real pressure campaign. Eventually, Warner Media gave in. They were launching HBO Max and needed content. COVID had stalled theatrical releases, and a 4-hour superhero epic was an easy way to get attention and watch time. Snyder was brought back not just to finish what he started, but to reshape it completely. He had access to all the footage he shot in 2016. He also got additional funding for new effects and limited reshoots, around $70 million. What he delivered in 2021 was more than just a director's cut, but instead a complete rebuild of a movie. Zack Snyder's Justice League is longer, darker, and far more focused than the 2017 version. It restructures the film entirely. Each character gets a proper arc, Steppenwolf has motivation, Cyborg becomes the emotional center, Superman's resurrection is treated with gravity instead of jokes. The plot is the same at its core. The Justice League forms to stop an alien invasion, but the way the story unfolds is a lot more deliberate and consistent. On a technical level, the Snyder Cut is very impressive. The cinematography is beautiful at times. The use of space in the frame feels intentional, especially in large-scale battle scenes. It looks and feels like a cohesive work, even if the story still has very big problems. There's a level of control here that was completely missing from the theatrical version. This is Snyder's voice without interference. But the flaws are still built into the foundation. The writing isn't sharp, the dialogue is clunky, the pacing drags for very long stretches, and the film leans very hard on hype moments and aura. These aren't people, these are action figures being posed in slow motion set to moody music, delivering vague lines about fate and unity. That could work, but it comes at the cost of emotional texture, and the epilogue is where the film just collapses in on itself. Right when it could have ended cleanly with the League united and standing together, it keeps going. We get a dragged-out dream sequence filled with sequel bait that will never pay off. Batman talks to Jared Leto's Joker, and then Deathstroke is there, and the Flash is there, and Amber Heard is there, which is really funny in retrospect, and none of it matters. These scenes undercut the resolution and remind you of how much Snyder wanted to keep this universe alive. It feels desperate and unfinished. If the movie had ended at the sunrise, it would have had a real impact. At the end of the day, I don't think Zack Snyder's Justice League redeems the Snyderverse. It still carries the same core problems: a shallow understanding of the characters, a lack of emotional range, and a reliance on spectacle over substance. But as a final entry in what I'd rather call the Snyder trilogy, it works. It feels like a real ending. Most franchises don't get that. They get rebooted, extended, or stitched into something worse. This one stopped, and even though it never lived up to the weight it tried to carry, it ended on Snyder's terms. That alone gives it value. As a filmmaker, I respect that. I respect any artist being allowed to finish their vision, especially when that vision is messy, personal, and divisive. I don't think it's a great movie by any means. I barely think it's a good one, but it's a real one. It puts it above most of what the DCEU became after. Warner Brothers had no plans to continue the Snyder story. After the Discovery merger, projects were shelved, budgets were slashed, and the DCEU was quietly buried. James Gunn was brought in to start things over, and the entire universe reset. The Snyderverse fell apart because it was built on tone and not structure. Warner Brothers wanted a franchise, Snyder wanted myth. Neither side budged, and it all fell apart. Alright, let's talk about Superman 2025. Now, this will not be a full breakdown of the movie. That video will very likely be a thing years after this, once I've actually had time to rewatch it, dig into the production history, and do the deep analysis that I normally do on this channel in a retrospective format. It's kind of hard to do a retrospective on a movie that I just saw. Instead, this is going to be more of a first impressions kind of review, and it's going to be split into two parts. I really want to emphasize this because if you haven't seen the movie yet, don't just put this on in the background and then walk away, because the first half is going to be completely spoiler free. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, you're safe to keep watching as of right now. The second half will go into full spoiler territory, and I will give you very clear warning before that starts. But for now, let's get into it. DC Bros, we won. We are so back. It's not hyperbole, it's not fanboy delusion. That is the honest reaction that I had sitting in the theater, watching Superman save people, crack a smile, and just feel like Superman again. From the first few minutes, the film makes one thing immediately clear. This is a comic book movie in the most literal sense. This is not a gritty reimagining, it's not a deconstruction of Superman or an elevated take. This is a comic book. Ink splashed onto the screen through dialogue, world building, and tone. And if you're like me, that is a huge win. It's colorful, it's fast, it doesn't need to explain itself. You either keep up or you get left behind. And for the average moviegoer, that might be overwhelming. Characters are introduced fast. Plot threads start before you realize what's happening, and Gunn doesn't care if you're caught up. But that doesn't mean that the film is confusing. It assumes the audience is smart enough to figure things out without holding their hand, and to me, that is just so refreshing. What anchors all of the chaos is David Corenswet. He's not just doing a Christopher Reeve impression, but instead he's actually trying to carry that same spirit. There's actual warmth again. For the first time in a major motion picture since like 1987, there's no detached stoicism, there's no quiet suffering, just a genuine desire to do good. And after years of Superman being treated like a god or a burden, it's honestly great. It makes me emotional, seeing the character smile and save people again. You can believe this is someone who inspires hope. And Corenswet nails it. Seriously, this dude is Superman. Like, you feel that as soon as he's on screen. When I read All-Star Superman now, like, his voice is what's going to kind of go through my brain whenever I read that. Like, that is Superman. He nailed it. He did. And I don't want to be one of those people that's like, you know, oh, is he better than Christopher Reeve? I don't like that. It's just, let's appreciate everyone for their own strengths, even Henry Cavill and Brandon Routh, actors that I wasn't too keen on them being Superman. But still, I do think that David Corenswet is one of the best to ever do it. One of. Rachel Brosnahan absolutely kills it as Lois Lane. I don't mean like she's just serviceable or she's like refreshing. She finally gives us a look at Lois as if she's a real person again. There's a hint of Margot Kidder in her performance, and she has the perfect mix of intelligence and boldness, and just enough to keep everyone else on their toes around her. She's very sharp, but she's never like smug or condescending. She actually does something in the plot instead of just standing around reacting to Superman. That alone puts her miles ahead of Kate Bosworth and Amy Adams. Brosnahan feels like someone who lives and breathes the job of a reporter, someone who wants to chase the story and who clearly has a history with Clark that's more than just forced chemistry. And there's also a bit of a dark side to that. You get the sense that, yes, this is quite literally her only personality trait, is being this like reporter figure. And so she struggles with having a relationship with Clark. That is a big part of the movie, and you really feel it with her performance. Meanwhile, Mr. Terrific steals the show. I don't want to say too much or ruin it, because the less you know, the better. But every single time he's on screen, the movie just lights up. I mean, seriously, this will create so many Mr. Terrific fans. I can see it already. Meanwhile, Nicholas Hoult is also a standout here. His Lex Luthor is doing his own thing in contrast to other prior on-screen iterations. And it works. What makes his version so compelling is the palpable bitterness. It's not world domination evil, but it's very personal. You can feel how much he resents Superman. Every line is laced with inferiority and petty jealousy. Like, this guy has been waiting his whole life to prove he's the smartest man in the room, and he still can't stand the fact that someone like Kal-El exists. Like, there are some scenes in here where he is watching Superman fight, and he's just like so bitter and angry, and he just wants him to die. And it's like, this is Lex Luthor. Like, you got it. Like, this is perfect. It's everything I wanted Lex Luthor to be in this movie. I am so happy that they got him right. No disrespect to Gene Hackman, and I guess full disrespect towards Kevin Spacey, but like, that version of the character, very, very, very solid, right? I think it's a solid take on the character for the world that they needed to inhabit. For this take on the character that is very comic book kind of oriented, like, you get very kind of Superman birthright here, he nails it. And then there's Nathan Fillion as Guy Gardner. He's exactly the right kind of annoying. He has this like smugness, kind of self-importance, but he's still a hero at the end of the day. He's just the last person that you would want on your team. I love the way he bounces off other characters and kind of pushes and prods them. It's great stuff. But he also plays him with a level of sincerity that avoids making him into a caricature. I've seen some people complain about just how many metahumans there are in this movie. For example, without spoilers again, I'll mention just the ones that were in the trailer. There's Superman, Green Lantern, Mr. Terrific, Hawkgirl, Metamorpho, the Engineer, Ultraman, and many others. However, I think everyone is utilized perfectly. Nothing ever feels overstuffed in that regard. It works really well with the comic book feel of the film. I mean, there have been so many times where I'll be reading a Batman story and then a bunch of random glup shittos end up showing up in the supporting cast, and it's like, yeah, I don't really know exactly who they are, but it works. And if you're an outsider, I'm sure you're gonna feel kind of the same way. It's like, well, I don't know who a Mr. Terrific is, but he's fun to watch. I don't mind him. Where the MCU feels like superheroes existing in our world now, the DCU feels like an entirely different universe that has its own history and mythos. People are very used to seeing all of this chaos and destruction, and I love that. It is infinitely more interesting than, what if Superman was real, and what would CNN have to say about it? Like, I don't care. I already live in that world. I'm miserable. I want some escapism, you know? Tonally, though, the film's biggest flaw is that it can't always pick a lane. You'll get a beautiful moment of sincerity followed by a joke that kind of interrupts it every now and then. There's a whiplash that never really derails the film, but there is just a bit of like, okay. There's a slight instinct by Gunn to undercut emotion. And while it's not as bad as his more indulgent moments in, say, Guardians of the Galaxy or The Suicide Squad, a little more restraint could have gone a long way. Ironically, though, I actually found myself wishing that this leaned more into James Gunn's style. The script feels like he's holding back. You can sense the moments where a needle drop would have elevated the sequence, where things want to get weird or surreal, but the movie pulls back and instead plays some gorgeous orchestral score by John Murphy and David Fleming. Part of me is like, God, I would have loved to have heard, like, Starman by David Bowie in certain sequences. It's like, right there, I can just imagine that song playing. But still, that shift from Gunn's usual routine is very likely intentional. This is a clean slate Superman. It's meant to reset the tone after the Snyder era, but once the dust settles, I hope the sequel really cuts loose. Like, think Spider-Man 2, where Raimi finally got to go full Sam Raimi. This could use a little bit of that chaos next time around. Even with the tonal bumps and some inconsistent plasticky VFX at points, the core mission is accomplished. Superman is no longer a godlike figure looming in the sky. he's human again. He's a hero, a reporter who still believes in doing the right thing, even when it's corny. And this movie makes that work. It repositions Superman as more than just a symbol, but as someone that you would actually want to root for and meet on the street. Not because he's flawless, but because he cares. You leave the theater feeling like something was repaired, and in a genre that's this burned out, that is a major accomplishment. Overall, Superman 2025 is a genuinely great movie and a massive step forward for the DCU. I'm still a little cautiously optimistic. I mean, it's not hard to be after the DCEU crash and burn, but if this is the foundation, we're in good hands. What makes this film special to me is how it reminded me of why I fell in love with Superman as a character in the first place. With comics, with heroes who actually give a damn. The optimism in this movie feels so right. It's the kind of hope that people want and need right now. And for the first time in a long time, I walked out of a Superman movie feeling like the hope was real. All right, for everyone that hasn't seen the movie yet, get out.
No! Everyone!
I highly recommend turning this video off because now we are about to go into spoiler territory. So go and see the movie and then come back and finish watching this video. Or don't. I don't care. I don't care. Anyways, final warning. Spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Okay. They're gone. Probably the most controversial plot point in the entire film is going to be the villainization of Superman's birth parents and Krypton itself. The reveal that Jor-El and Lara sent Kal-El to Earth to conquer it and eventually repopulate the planet with Kryptonians is bold. It was really funny seeing Bradley Cooper show up as Jor-El, but I'm not sure how to feel about the direction that they took here. At first, I assumed that the second half of Jor-El's message, where, Clark hadn't known about the whole conquering Earth thing, was tampered with by Lex to manipulate public opinion. But no, this movie goes out of its way to say that this part is very much real. Kal-El was, in the original plan, a Kryptonian sleeper agent. And while that plays into the film's nature versus nurture theme, which is handled well across the board, it clashes with the immigrant metaphor that James Gunn himself said is central to this version of Superman. Making your immigrant protagonist secretly sent to conquer the place that he's integrating into has some very dicey implications there. Personally, I think this would have worked better as Ultraman's story. Let him embody the darker what-if of Superman's origins, and let Kal be the contrast. Let's scrap the whole Kryptonian thing, make it where Lex did manipulate it so that, people hate Superman. You can keep all that and find out it was bullshit later down the line, but have Ultraman exist as being that, here's Superman if he was raised in a lab. He would be evil. Don't make him stupid right away. What I also hope they kind of do for the sequel is that they bring Ultraman back, but as Bizarro. I recently made this kind of mock-up thing to show what that might look like. I don't know. But I really hope they go even more comic booky with the sequel, and this is just speculation at this point, but having Bizarro like that would be just a dream of mine. I love Bizarro, or as Bizarro would say, I hate Bizarro. Getting back to the movie itself and this whole sort of nature versus nurture theme being presented through his original purpose being sent here from Krypton, I don't fully love the execution, but I do see the potential. I think it really sets the stage for some massive DCU story expansions later down the line. Like, if Jor-El was part of a colonization plan, where does that leave someone like General Zod? Was he working with them all along? And more importantly, what does that mean for Brainiac? In the comics, Brainiac famously shrinks and bottles Kandor, Krypton's capital city, before the planet explodes. That bottled city has always been a symbol of Krypton's lost legacy, but in this universe, it could be something far more dangerous. Like, for a second, imagine Brainiac showing up in the next Superman film as a villain, and you realize he's not a villain. He's actually more of like a twist hero where he has Kandor and he's like, I'm trying to keep this thing together here. Like, all these bottle cities that I have are all like evil fucking places and I'm trying to contain it, Superman, and you're not fucking helping one bit. Like, that would be mind-blowing, and it would work too because Brainiac has been a good guy in the comics in the past. I think that'd be a neat little storyline to pursue. Or here's the other one, like, again, this is just fan fiction at this point. Imagine a whole city of superpowered conquerors in a jar, and Brainiac is sort of using it like a Pandora's box, where he's like, don't fuck with me or else I'm gonna make this thing normal size again, and Superman is going to be screwed because all of these Kryptonians are just going to overpower him because it's a whole city of them. That could be a wild setup for a movie if they go the Brainiac route. So no, I don't hate the plot thread as a concept. I think it opens up a lot, but in the context of this specific movie, I think it's a little clunky. The themes are solid, the implications are very exciting, but the delivery could have used a bit more finesse. I think my favorite moment in the entire movie is the scene where Mr. Terrific takes out all of Luthor's guards. It's really well done. It reminds me a lot of the whole Yondu Arrow sequences from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Like, out of everything else in the entire movie, it's probably the most Guardians-esque scene that Gunn lets himself indulge in. Just pure controlled chaos with a character absolutely owning the screen. Stylistically, it also kind of works with the rest of the movie. A lot of the fight scenes kind of lean into those long, fluid, one-shot fight scenes that you kind of got from, like, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 with the Beastie Boys battle in the hallway. Like, there's a lot of that here. There's a lot of spinning cameras, tracking movement, and momentum-heavy staging. But here, it really, really, really works. The cameos in this movie were genuinely fantastic. They land because they're funny, but they also serve the larger universe that Gunn is slowly building out without derailing the actual story. Supergirl showing up at the end got a massive reaction, like Captain America wielding Thor's hammer in Endgame level of applause in my theater. I was shocked at how hyped people were, especially considering that the last two versions of Supergirl were Supergirl 1984 and The Flash, neither of which were very good. It just shows how much goodwill still exists for these characters, and how audiences are just ready for a version that finally gets it right. John Cena popping up as Peacemaker on a political talk show also just worked so well. It came out of nowhere, and the theater just died laughing. But it also kind of like made me perk up a bit, thinking, you know, beyond this movie, like, okay, is the Suicide Squad canon now? Like, is that official? Because beyond Peacemaker, a few familiar faces from the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker show up here. I'm not mad about it. I'm more curious to see like how all this is going to be handled. And I'm guessing that Peacemaker Season 2 will clarify things, but I do hope that this doesn't spiral into a messy continuity problem down the line. Like, if it was up to me, I'd just say, fuck it, the Suicide Squad is canon. I think you could reasonably get away with that. Like, you just have to carry Margot Robbie over as Harley Quinn, or if you don't want to do that, just have a new Harley Quinn. There have been multiple Harley Quinns in the comics. You can always do that. Also, major shout out to Will Reeve, the son of Christopher Reeve, who showed up in this film as a news reporter. That was great. Thank you for that, James Gunn. I really appreciated seeing that, because you see that and you're like, well, yeah, duh. They should have done that years ago. That's a genius cameo move. What I like most, though, about these cameos was that they weren't distracting. They never once were like, we're going to derail this entire scene by having a funny bit, or, you know, like, we're going to have this cameo here to set up a future movie. With Supergirl showing up, it works because, you know, yeah, they're making Supergirl next year, but it also works because it's like, it's a funny bit. It explains why Krypto is so poorly trained in this whole movie. Which, by the way, Krypto was great. I haven't even mentioned him yet. Great. Now, I'm not sure where to put this, so I figured I'd just throw it in at the end of the review. I got the chance to see this movie in IMAX a few days before it was released to the masses. Now, this might sound insane from someone like me that loves movies, but I have never seen a movie in IMAX before until now. And I gotta say, I don't understand the hype around IMAX. I really didn't notice much of a difference between IMAX and a normal movie theater experience. Maybe the usual theater I go to just has really high quality audio and video or something, but I don't know. I didn't get it. I was like, all right, this is just a normal theater experience. But the crowd was really awesome. It was a sold-out screening, and there were people dressed up as Superman. It felt like an event, and the reason why is like there were only a few of these showings throughout Wisconsin, so I really had to kind of drive a bit to go and, you know, see it at this specific location. It was also the first sold-out screening that I've ever been to since Avengers Endgame. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I live in a rural part of the state and usually see movies on Tuesday afternoons, where my local theater chain has a discount deal for tickets where it's $6 for a ticket. So while my experiences in theaters usually involve me and like 3 old people sitting in the front row, it was pretty cool being in a packed screening with fans that were just as excited as I was. But I want to know what you think. Let me know down below in the comments. Did you love this movie? Did you hate it? I want to know. And with all of that, this is the end of my big, long Superman retrospective series where I go over every major Superman theatrical release. Really quick, here are the rankings of each of these movies. I'm just going to throw them up on screen right now. I kind of was like going back and forth on Superman 78 and Superman 25. I still don't know which one I like more, but for now, I'm just going to say Superman 78. By a very slight margin. Now, the past 2 weeks have been absolutely bonkers for me. I have spent the past 14 days editing videos nonstop, and I really want to take a bit of a break before jumping into any new big projects. Seriously, I have been posting videos almost daily, and if I have to look at an editing timeline any more than I have to, I'm going to vomit. Maybe I might start streaming more frequently again. I really don't know, but what I do know is that I am so thankful for all of you who decided to join me on this trip through a Cliff Notes version of the cinematic history of Superman. Massive thank you to our channel members. Your support means the absolute world. For just $1.99 a month, you can get early access to videos, access to members-only videos, access to all of our live stream VODs, and you get credited as an executive producer in all of our film projects. Their names are listed on screen. Actually, they're gone now. Bye. I'm Cole McCormack. You're watching Firewood Media, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.